Alan?
Let's see. All right. I first came to Sanibel in 1939, and we came here looking for seashells, and we stayed in the little schoolhouse across from where Clarence Rutland's old house was on the main road. That's where we stayed when we first came to the island. Frank Bailey says that we could camp in there. So that's where we were.
And when did you come to live? When did you move here to stay?
We built a little place there on which used to be Hires Way, and it's Donix now, I guess. But that was in 41, just the start of the war. In fact, we were in the old schoolhouse across from Clarence when the war broke out. I was listening to the radio, and the Japanese bombed Pearl Harbor.
Alan, tell them the name of your parents.
Oh, Hires. It was Martin Hires and Sadie Hires, and he was my stepfather. And they had built by the sea, which in the old days it was Hires by the sea. Started it over there, motel. In fact, it was the first motel, I guess, on Sanibel, year round.
Well, I'm Joe Pickens.
And I'm Jim Pickens.
And we came here in 1952 for a 3-week vacation in February and March. And we had a wonderful time, but we thought, well, we've seen Sanibel Island, we won't be back. Easter, we came back and bought our property. In August, we were living here. We thoroughly enjoyed it. Our son, Jim, who has Photo Sanibel, was 16 the day we arrived. So he went to high school in Fort Myers. And his first year of high school there was his junior year. The kids went across, I think they left the island at 6 o'clock in the morning on Jake Stokes' boat, the Susie II, and they went to Punta Rassa, where the school bus met them. The following year, they arranged the high school kids' classes so they wouldn't have to have anything the first 2 hours, so they could go on the ferry, and it wasn't quite such a long day for them.
Joe, what other kids went on that boat that Jake?
Oh, well, let's see. There was Ralph Woodring and Donald and Marietta Hires, and the Wiles girls from Captiva, Carolyn, and, well, I guess Carolyn was the only one then, because Charlotta had already graduated. And the Rhodes boys, Billy.
The LG? Was he that?
He was younger.
Oh.
LG was younger. I don't remember whether there's anyone else or not. That
Irving, I think, with Don.
Irving and Billy, probably. Yeah.
Joe remarked that we came down and spent 3 weeks on Sanibel Island. Our intention when we came down was to spend about 3 or 4 days on Sanibel and spend the rest of the time and tour the state. And when we got on Sanibel Island, we just fell in love with the place and stayed the whole 3 weeks. And on the way back home, we ran into snow and icy roads for the last about 400 miles of getting home. And we had as bad a spell of winter from then on out as we'd ever had, I think, in the state of Missouri. So that kept impressing Sanibel on our mind. And we found that we would just kept talking about Sanibel all the time. I said one day, you know, someday we're going to retire, and I hope, and we just seem to like Sanibel so well. Let's go back down and see if we can buy us a little piece of property down there. And It'll be less expensive now than it ever will.
That's
And
for sure.
if we want to retire down there, we'll have it. If we don't, it'd probably be a good investment. So we came down and bought some property and went on back home. And of course, that put the icing on the cake. You know, that piece of property was down there, and that added to the attraction. I got up one morning. We'd talked about this every day, and I got up one morning and I said, what do you think about we sell our property up here and move to Sanibel? If we like it as well as we think we're going to, why stay up here? Why not go down there and enjoy it? So we put everything we had for sale up for there, and fortunately sold it right away and moved down in August of that same year. And we've loved every minute of it. We loved every minute of it until we moved away some 10 years ago.
Do you remember how we used to get newspapers on the island? How was that?
Buddy Bob's.
Yeah, Buddy Bob's with his dawn patrol. He had a pontoon plane, and he would land at Bailey's store and leave off newspapers there, and then to Cassidy Bell, I guess Island Inn, and then to Captiva, leave off the newspapers.
Sometimes when the weather was a little rough on the bay, he just dropped them out on the road there right by the store.
Mm-hmm.
They'd bounce up and bundled up, and they'd bounce up and take them in and put them on the rack.
Well, you could also take a ride with him.
Oh, yes.
Yeah, and he brought people from the airport,
Right.
or took them back to the airport, or train, or however they were going.
Didn't Pat Murphy deliver the newspaper sometimes when he was delivering the mail?
Well, I don't remember about that, but I don't
Mhm.
see why not.
Yeah.
Yeah, I think he did.
Pat used to deliver them later. But Buddy Bob's used to come in at the Island Inn and the Casabel and come up on the beach,
Mhm.
pick up passengers and take them out, either to Fort Myers or fly them around the islands to see the islands. And his landing strip was right there on the beach.
Yeah.
And speaking of landing, Tom Wood, also had a pontoon plane. And he could set it down in that canal over in the Bailey Tract and
Yes, he could.
never miss. The mail came too by mailboat, remember?
Mm-hmm. Oh, yes.
And that was sad when that mailboat stopped running. They had quite a ceremony up on Captiva and scattered flowers in the water and cried.
Yes, and he had a stamp made, the last run of the mail.
Uh-huh.
And we were on it. You didn't.
Now, that was fair. You were on the mailboat?
I was on the mailboat.
We weren't on the mailboat, but we were on the last ferry.
Fair, right.
Yeah.
You used to get on the mailboat when it came to Sanibel, and then it went to Pine Island, and then to Captiva, and then back to Pine Island, and then back to Sanibel. And you could get on Sanibel and make the round with the mailboat. And it was a very nice little trip. And I remember the first time we ever did that, the thing that impressed me most was the porpoise that went along with us through the bay.
The mailboat stopped at Captiva long enough to have the mail sorted and bring back the day's mail from Captiva. And it gave you just long enough to have lunch at May and Bill's little Sunshine Cafe.
Alan, when you were talking about your parents coming here, didn't they live in a little house on Donax that we called the Birdcage?
Yes. That was there was one little house up above there that was, I guess, one of the homesteaders, or places where some of them maybe the help lived. And but that was the first house built on Donax. It's been named several different. Slocum Road was one name, Hires, and that Donax has been named several times.
Who owned that house?
That was Mother and Dad.
Oh, they built that.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, I see. They paid. They bought the lot from Frank Bailey, and I think it was $250, I believe it was, for that.
Speak of Pat Murphy, occasionally we do as we discuss these things. Pat was the local mail carrier, rural route carrier. And Pat would meet the mail boat and pick up his mail and bring it down to the little post office down near the ferry dock. And they'd work it out down there, and Pat would run his route and bring in the mail off the route, and they'd work that out, and then he'd take it back and put it on the boat, mail boat, to go into Fort Myers. And usually that got him through with his mail route for about 3 o'clock in the afternoon. And we had bought property down near the lighthouse to build on, and there was no electricity down there. We didn't get electricity for about 4 months or so after we got here. So from 3 o'clock in the afternoon, Pat and I didn't have much to do, and every day almost he'd come by and pick me up and we'd go fishing. We'd go down to the Bailey dock and catch some bait and fish. And I don't tell people how the fishing was back in those days because they know I'm lying when I tell them. But we would fish almost every day, and it wasn't to go see if you could catch some fish. It would be just to go fishing, and I remember Pat would say, we'd catch fish for a while, and Pat would say, let's go over on the Gulf and name the place where we'd go and see if we can't catch something different. That's the difference in the fishing in those days than now.
Back to Pat Murphy again. In those days, there were no telephones on the island. There were telephones. There was a line from Island Inn to Bailey's store, and from Casa Ebel to Bailey's store. And Bailey's had telegraph service. And if any message came in for guests at either hotel, they could phone it in. Otherwise, the telegrams went out with Pat Murphy. And if you wanted to send a message to anybody on the island, you just told Pat, gave him a little note, and he would pass it around. And I remember so well, one time a note came around from Daisy Mayer. And I can almost remember the exact words. It said, Bailey's had some lovely ground round today, so I made a big meatloaf. Let's all meet at the community house and have a party. And so we did. And anybody could use the community house then. All you had to do is come up to Clarence's and get the key and move your party in.
And the Clarence is Clarence Rutland, whose home
we're sitting
in. It is the Island Historical Museum. And Daisy Mayer was Eleanor Dormer's mother. A lot of people called her Aunt Daisy.
She had one of the few houses on the bay, and she always left a light on her porch at night so that the people in the boats could find their way in. She was such a lovely lady. I went there one time. She was very instrumental in the early Audubon too. I went there one time on Audubon business, and she grabbed me and said, come in here quick. And she had a balcony built on the side of her house, upstairs, so she could watch the birds back there in the swamp behind her house. And at that particular time, the snowy egrets were doing a mating dance, and so we got to see that. Remember the night we had Jake and Pearl Stokes' 25th wedding anniversary party? And we sort of, it was a covered dish deal, and we sort of ran out of something to do. So somebody said to Jim, can you call a square dance? Well, we didn't have any PA system or anything in the community house. So I think Alan took his pickup and we went up to the community church and got the PA system and brought it down to the community house, and we had a square dance. And the square dances went on then for several years. We had square dances
Every Saturday night.
Every Saturday night at the community house.
Talking about fishing, Alan, reminded me of the time that you and Uncle Arthur and I don't know who else was fishing for sharks off Miss Daisy Mayer's dock. And Arthur laid your big rod and reel down with the break off, and something picked up the bait and jerked it off out into the bay. Alan was bemoaning the loss of his favorite fishing rod. And I was down there a week or so later, went down one evening to fish a little while, and I just had an ordinary spinning rig with about maybe a 12-pound test line and a light rod. And I was casting off out into the bay from the end of the pier, and I hooked onto something that I kept trying to pull loose from, and finally it did work it loose and pulled it into the dock, and it was Alan's big fishing rod, and I had hooked it right in the tip guide of the rod with the hook on my lure. And I shook the seaweed and some of stuff off of it, brought it up and set it by the door. They weren't home, and I brought it up and set it right by the front door. And the next day or two or week or so, I saw Goldie, and I said, "What did Alan say when he found his rod?" She said he just stood there and looked at it, and he said, "That can't be. That just can't be."
That was really surprising. I thought that was a gone rod.
Well, of course, I don't remember the really early shell fairs because I think they were held at Island Inn. But at the time we came and were interested in shells and shelling, there was no competition in the shell fair. There were no ribbons given or no trophies or anything like that. Everybody just made a pretty display and showed it and gave it a name. And I remember one year somebody called theirs Rhapsody in Rose because they had mostly pink shells, and somebody else had Gold from the Gulf because they had mostly yellow. And I had Jewels from the Sea because they were all tiny little miniature. And that's the way the shell fair was operated in those days. And some people would bring in the same boxes year after year after year, you know. Clarence Rutland had beautiful, beautiful seashell boxes. And so did Scotia Bryant. And they would show those same ones every year. You remember the firemen's balls?
Oh, yes.
They'd have them at the community house, and I think they had them on Captiva. I don't remember. Where'd they have them on Captiva?
The barn, wasn't it?
Where was
The
it?
barn.
I think it was a barn south seas.
Maybe that's where it
Well,
was.
didn't they have one at Casabel one time?
Yes.
Yes, they did. Mm-hmm.
That was the best party of all. It was closer to the bar, you know.
Do you remember there was a car wreck after that one? Remember Go-Go ran into a tree?
I don't remember that.
No.
Too many hush puppies and bear.
And the fish fries down at the lighthouse.
Yeah.
Yeah. I remember one night when Goldie and Alan and we, I don't know who else, were all driving on the beach in your pickup, hoping we'd see a turtle, a loggerhead turtle. And we got down to the end of Seagrape Lane, and the mullet, remember that? The mullet were just so thick, they were just jumping and jumping and jumping. So Alan said, "You mind if I go home and get my mullet net?"
At one time, had the little Model A Ford. And that's when we were living down on Donix. And we used to drive the beach, of course, looking for shells and fish and what have you. And it was a low tide, and Blind Pass was up about where the Wolford Road comes out, and on the beach. And it was low enough to where there was just a couple little ripples across for the pass. It was getting down far enough to where there wasn't much water flowing through. So I bumped over those and went on up to Captiva and drove all the way down to where you turn off to go to the Timmy's. No, in fact, went on down a little bit
Yeah,
farther.
the road used to go on down.
Right. Yeah, I was on the beach. I drove the beach from Sanibel all the way up to upper part of Captiva. And turned around and come back. I think it was the last car trip on the beach from the
Yeah.
lighthouse too.
Well, I remember when we were building some houses down on the lighthouse end of Sanibel, and Joe Whiteman from Captiva was our electrician.
Mhm.
And Joe had that old Volkswagen van that he was using for a work vehicle. He had changed the name to Volkswagen, Volts, instead of Volkswagen.
Right.
And I remember Joe would, when he'd come to work down there, he would always come down the beach and drive in on the island to get to the job. Now, where he got on it up there, I don't know.
Mhm.
But Joe drove up and down the beach all the time when he was working down on that end of the island.
Wasn't his washboarding.
That's
That's
right.
That
That's right.
San Cap Road was awful rough.
Oh, boy.
That trip from Sanibel to Captiva was grueling over
From Tarpon
Rushmore.
Bay Road up.
Mhm.
Was bad.
Well, almost. It was from where the roads lived.
Oh, yes, yeah.
The pavement ended then, and oh, it was a rough trip.
That was the Henry Road.
And I used to go with Priscilla Murphy in her Jeep. And she had a Jeep that didn't have a top on it. And she had the steering wheel to hang on to, but I didn't have anything. And I was just tossing side to side with that Jeep.
Do you remember the year that road was paved?
Well, it was probably about 53, 54. Do you remember?
It was around,
I
it was
remember.
around 54, I
Mhm.
think it was.
Uh-huh.
They used to, when people come from town on the last ferry that lived on Captiva,
Mhm.
Mrs. Hayford was one of them,
Mhm.
and they'd come by our house just to speed, to
Yeah.
see who was going to get on the road first,
So they wouldn't have the dust.
so we wouldn't have to eat the other one's guts going to Captiva.
Well, it was smoother the faster you went. If you went slow, you went down in all the choke holes.
Oh, yeah.
If you went real fast, you just hit the tops of them, and it said brrrr as you went up the road.
60, 70 miles an hour.
Yeah.
Or some of them even went faster than
Yeah.
that. Smoother it got.
Yeah,
But when they had to slow down for the S curve there at the Legion Hall,
yeah.
and Uncle Art and I got out one day, I says, "These corrugations are awful deep today. It's awful rough because you either had to go fast or just go in and out of it
Mhm.
real slow." And so we got down and I took my rule and put it down between the corrugation, and he looked over from the side. They were 6 inches deep,
Mhm.
Yeah.
so that was pretty rough.
That's right.
When was the Blind Pass Bridge built?
Which one?
The
The
first one.
Let's see, the wooden one was replaced by the concrete one.
About 1955,
I
wasn't it?
think it was around 55. Yes.
But there was a wooden one before that.
Mm-hmm. See, there used to be one. The first wooden bridge was where you go down the San Cap Road and make the right turn to go to the bridge there now. Used to didn't make that turn. That went straight on across, and that was the old first bridge, I guess, to Captiva. That's when there was a lot of Captiva out there then, and most of Captiva. Well, when we came here, why the Captiva had already washed half away. From Uncle Art, he came here in 1900, and they had, of course, homestead days back in those days. And there was a house there on the other end of Captiva, and he had a avocado pear grove, because he said he used to go up there and get avocado pears. Took his wagon and horse and drove up there. And the fellow that owned that drilled a well in the middle of the island. And when we came, why, it was out in the edge of the water. In fact, you could wade along and stick your head down in the water and get a drink right out of the Gulf. Flowing.
It was flowing that,
Mm-hmm.
was it artesian?
Yes.
Mhm.
So from the time they drilled the well, and it was, I don't know, that was probably before the storm was 26, so well was drilled probably back in the 16, 18, somewhere in there. Why, Captiva was half washed away when we came here.
Is that right? And I mean, from Upper Captiva? Is that what you mean? Was Upper Captiva part of it then, or are you talking about
No,
Gulf
this is,
side?
of course, after the 26th storm, I think, washed out the pass, which would be Redfish Pass. And of course, when that pass opened up, why Captiva started eroding a lot worse
Yes.
than it had before.
When we came here, I'm sure when we came here that the road that went all the way up Captiva was still went along the Gulf,
Mm-hmm.
All the way to
Yeah.
South Seas?
all the way to South
Right.
Seas.
Because that's where the IWA had their water lines,
Yes,
but they had to move them back.
yes. Well, at that time when you could still drive up the beach all the way to South Seas, out in the water, you could see some of the old foundations and so forth that were left from houses that had been along there.
Susan,
I used to like to fish off there around those old foundations and things. It was a good place to
So
be.
Alan, you mean from that avocado farm in 1916 to when you came in 1939, already half of Captiva was gone?
Mm-hmm.
Now-
Sure was, because the fellow that had homesteaded it went from the bay to the Gulf Beach, and he put the well down the middle of the island. And when we came, the artesian well was out into the edge of the surf.
I've heard that that well is now about a quarter-mile out into the Gulf, and occasionally boats will go over it
Yeah.
and be aware of it.
Yeah, because it never was capped. It just rusted off and flowed. And also, back in that time, we'd go up to Redfish Pass to fish,
Mm-hmm.
and I'd have one of these old level line reels.
Mm-hmm.
Of course, that was the thing then.
Sure.
And had a fair sized lure on it. And when I threw it over towards Upper Captiva, I'd have to thumb it down or it'd go up on the beach.
Mm-hmm.
That's how narrow redfish was.
Yes. Yeah.
Ernest Kinsey told us one time that when he was a boy, there were citrus groves between Captiva and what is now the Gulf. There was that much land out there that there were citrus groves when he was a boy.
West side of the road that went up on
Just before you get up to
South
bridge.
Seas.
The South Seas.
Yeah.
Oh, yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, there's citrus trees. There's citrus groves up there. And avocado pear groves.
Yeah. And Ernest also said that when the boats first came to Sanibel Island, they didn't come in down, came to the islands, to Sanibel Captiva, they didn't come in down on the east end of Sanibel, they came in up on the end of Captiva and came from Punta Gorda.
Mm-hmm.
And that his folks, his parents, grandparents, or whoever, used to put a horse and buggy on the boat and get off on the upper end of Captiva and drive down horse and buggy all the way down to Sanibel, and on to Sanibel on down to the lighthouse. Put the horse and buggy on the boat and go back to Punta Gorda.
You remember how the mosquitoes were in those days?
I remember, and Milker said they weren't bad. But I don't know where she was. Wherever I was, they were bad.
You mean
Tell about that.
she was so used to them that they weren't bad? Oh, they were just awful. That was before the days of these insecticide cans where you push the spray cans. Everybody had a flip gun. And whenever someone came to your door, you met them with a flip gun. And you sprayed them all over before they were allowed in your house.
Tell about waiting at the ferry with the windows up
Oh, yeah,
in the
you
summertime.
did. You waited at the ferry with the windows up on your car. Now, this was only in the summertime. In the wintertime, they weren't bad. And I can still see the kids running off the ferry, the high school kids. While they were on the ferry, and the ferry was moving, of course, the mosquitoes weren't bothering them. But as soon as they landed, those kids would run just as hard as they could. And I used to meet them down there at the ferry landing, and they'd run as hard as they could, and I'd be in the car with my flip gun, and they would jump in the car, and I would deposit them at their different homes. The Wiles girls used to drive down to Bailey's store and leave their. Well, that was when when Jake used to take them over on the boat, they drove their car down to Bailey's store and left it. And Glenn, let's see,
Rob.
what, Roberts, yeah.
Glenn Roberts with Virginia Stokes.
And one of the Wade children. Which one of the Wades?
Chad?
The Ways, not that on the boat, they didn't,
They didn't get on?
they didn't come down till
They
about.
weren't here that first winter.
Was Glenn Roberts here then?
Glenn.
He was captain up there,
Uh-huh.
wasn't he? And his son.
Yeah.
One other way they use to get the mosquitoes out too, we found out. Get in the car and open the door.
Yeah,
And the updraft underway
yeah.
would draw out a lot of the mosquitoes. You didn't have a flint gun.
I remember one time I complained about mosquitoes to Uncle Arthur Gibson. And he thought about what I said for a minute. You know, he always took his time and was rather droll. And he said, well, you'll probably get used to them, but I doubt you ever learn to like them.
Well, you did kind of get used to the mosquitoes, and you knew how to dress and how to conduct yourself. But you know, the thing you never do get used to, I think, are sandflies. There's no defense against sandflies. And I guess they're still here.
Not like they used to be.
Not like they used to be
You mean the new, those Sims?
in those seams.
So, yeah, you paint your window screens with floor oil.
Yeah, Bailey's had a barrel of floor oil in the store. You went and bought a gallon of floor oil and you paint your screens with the floor oil because the sandflies couldn't get through. Then every 3 days you had to take your screens out and wash them because they were so clogged that
With
the air
sandflies.
couldn't get through. Yeah, because you know we didn't have air conditioning back then. In fact, we didn't have. We sometimes didn't have enough electricity to run a fan.
And certainly no ceiling fan.
Nobody had a ceiling fan. I had been told, maybe you know more about this than I do, that the island wasn't wired for electricity until during World War II. Is that right?
After the war,
After the war.
yeah, they had that rural electric
Yeah.
that the government sponsored because some of the power companies, unless it's so many users, it wouldn't warrant them to put it in. So the government surplused the rural electric, and that's when we got ours.
Well,
The
and
records say 41.
41.
Yeah.
Do they?
But maybe everybody didn't have electricity to their houses. Maybe they didn't have the poles.
Well, I also was told that they didn't have the proper material and they used aluminum wire, and that's why it was breaking all the time. And the least little storm came up, you know, the lines would break.
Well, another thing that would knock our electricity out periodically was a sailboat would go underneath the power line where it came across the bay, and that mast would catch on the power line and tear it down.
So they'd have to get a special ferry and bring the trucks over and try to find the break. It always happened about mealtime. And of course we'd light the candles and the lamps, but nobody had electric stoves in those days. We all had gas stoves, and a lot of people had gas refrigerators. That's the only way you could be sure.
Of course, people did have generators over here.
Yeah, a lot of people did have generators.
Casabel had a generator that they used over
Yeah.
there. When they did start to put the power in over here, why, they were running the lines down Periwinkle and then through there, and a group of people over here got together and was helping them clear the right of way for free. They were wanting to see
sure.
those power lines come over here.
Well, now this that we're discussing now, you understand, is what some people refer to as the good old days.
And when those poles come in, and some of those high lines were copper wires, and they were kind of bright copper
Yeah.
color.
Yeah,
And a lot of them remarked, says, "Oh boy, it looks like Christmas."
yeah.
Well, you
The
remember
power
that
poles didn't look bad at all.
after the 1960 hurricane, the same thing happened. the men on Sanibel cleared the
Yeah.
right of way so that when the power company finally came over, they could do it, get our electricity going faster. Why don't you talk
We had
about
no-
1960 hurricane?
We had no help from the county at all at 1960 hurricane. It so happened that a school bus was left over here, and Jim drove the school bus on a schedule for people to get to wherever they were going to on the island, because most of their cars were on the other side.
Well, you understand too that the ferry docks were washed out.
Yeah.
Now the ferry could come over, but no vehicles could could get over. And the ferry would come over and bring foot passengers, and they'd get off down at the ferry dock down by the lighthouse. Well, people lived on the north end of Sanibel and on Captiva, and they were still far from home. And the school bus was sitting there at the standard service station. So I just went up, and Jim filled it up with gasoline, and I started a bus shuttle to deliver people up the island.
Delivered them first to the community house where they got typhoid shots.
Yeah.
Because we
And,
had 3 nurses on the island who lived here.
Somehow the word leaked out that the school bus was being used over here, and some county official came over in a very official manner and caught up with me up at the service station. And he said, you know, you can't do this. And I said, well, I'm sorry to hear that. Nobody told me. He said, we can't permit it because of insurance, and went through various things. And I listened and agreed with him. And when he got through, I said, that's fine. We just won't do it anymore as long as you're over here. But I said, these people come trying to get back to their homes to see if they're damaged or what has to be done, and there's no way for them to get up there. And I said, quite frankly, I'm going to try to see that they get up there. And I had a 5-gallon can of white gasoline that I was going to take on the bus and take up to Twin Waters Inn, because they had no electricity and they had a stove that they could use white gasoline to cook, and that's the only way they had to cook. And he said, what's that? And I said, I don't know what that is. He took the top off and sniffed in the can. He said, I believe that's gasoline. I said, well, could be. He said, you're not going to take that on the bus. And then I had to explain to him all about the people up there going to starve to death if they didn't get that gasoline. And I set it on the bus while he was there, and we took off for Captiva. That's the last we heard of that.
You remember the Coast Guard brought people over too?
Yes.
After the hurricane, returning to their homes.
Yeah, a lot of the private boats, people who own boats here on the island, they took people back and forth. I think even then it was several days before the ferry could rig a way to even take foot passengers. But
the docks were out.
the docks were washed out.
Which hurricane was that?
Donna. Hurricane Donna in 1960.
You know, as long as, let's see, we came here in '39, and they had the 44 storm, and then the 60 storm. That's the only two we've ever had.
Been lucky having.
Since it's been '39.
Yeah.
The 44 was on the eye. The eye came through. We were living down on Bonix, and we were so close out to the beach, and we decided, well, maybe we better move back inland. So we gathered everything up and come up and stayed in across the street from Bailey's old house. And there was a little house there that one of the fellows that worked down at the store, Ed Sherman, and lived there. So we stayed there until the eye come over, and it's a pretty good storm. And it was about 10 o'clock at night when the eye hit, and it was calm. You could see the stars, birds chirping around in the center of that thing. And we was out in the middle of Periwinkle. And Dad says, well, he says, the backside of the storm is going to be a little stronger than the front. He thought, be more water and so forth. So we went across the street and went in, and Ernest and Frank Bailey, they were the only two there at that time in the big house. And so we moved in there with them. And we spent the other half in the Bailey house. But that's the only two storms that we really had, is Donna. But the eye of the storm, I think 26 had the eye too, according to Uncle Arthur. And but that is the only eye that we've had that I know of, is the 44 that I was in.
Which storm do you think was the worst?
44. It flooded the island all over but Wolford. Everything had salt on it. And Uncle Art says that he was in both. He was in the 26 and the 44. And he said they're very close to being the same as far as salt water.
And 60, and he was in the 60s.
Yeah, he was in the 62.
It wasn't a very wet hurricane. Donna wasn't.
Donna was not, no. And it wasn't very much salt water either. There was some that went across on the lighthouse end of the
we
island.
had, we had
Yeah, the lighthouse end of the island got it.
We had 100 red hibiscus bushes after Hurricane Donna. We didn't have any.
Killed every bush,
Yeah.
the salt water.
But I think it must have been the 44 hurricane that Scotia Bryant was telling about. They were in the lighthouse, one of the lighthouse buildings. And she said they could hear the water slapping up against the floor of the lighthouse buildings.
There was watermarks on the floor joists underneath the lighthouse. So the little wave action and got to the bottom of the floor joist.
Well, I remember Jake Stokes telling me about, I don't know which hurricane it was, I don't remember anymore, but he had a car that he didn't take up to Wolford on the high spot up there, and he parked it down near the lighthouse into the island, and he drove it up on the high part of the island and drove it into a clump of sea grape bushes. And the water came up level with the bottom of the windows. So that would have been 4 feet above the top of the ground at the high spot on the east end of Sanibel Island, and that was quite a lot of water on the island.
Did you remember what Belton and Miriam Johnson did during the hurricanes? They would just get in the boat and they'd take it up into the mangroves, and they'd stay in the boat as long as the hurricane was going on. They said that was the safest place to be during a hurricane.
Well, after Donna, seeing so many smash boats over at Ponderosa, from that marina over there, I wouldn't think it was safe.
They just got up into the mangroves, I guess, so tightly that they couldn't be washed out.
The mangroves on Sanibel, or where, or up the river?
No, either Sanibel or Captiva. They lived on Captiva.
Yeah, or maybe up over behind Waukee.
Yeah, somewhere like that.
So they'd be sheltered from the wind.
Speaking of the mangroves, remember when we used to have oyster roasts with those mangrove oysters? Weren't they good? Tell how we did that, Alan. How the mangrove.
Mangrove oysters. Yeah, you go along the mangroves and find a cluster of them that had the largest ones on it, and you build a fire and roast them right in the fire. Well, heat them up enough to where they opened up, and then you just shell them and eat them.
As I remember, they were stacked up like a teepee. Then we cut the roots off the mangrove with the oysters on them, and then just stack them up like a teepee over the fire.
Right.
Most people don't believe that oysters grow on trees.
No, that's right. That's right.
Oh, they sure do.
Yeah.
You don't find many of them now, but there were.
Remember how the scallops used to be out in the bay too?
Yeah.
My Jim used to take our little boat and go out there, he and Donald and some of the other boys, and come back with a wash tub full of scallops.
Wouldn't take very long.
That's right. And boy, they were good.
Oh, they were good. On the bridge and the causeway.
Yeah.
Causeway, I think, deferred a lot of the river water back up through Pine Island Sound and scallops can't tolerate any
Yeah.
fresh water. They have to be pure salt.
Yeah.
Mhm.
What
And,
about red tide?
therefore, they never would come back, would they? Because that water is still,
Oh, yes, well, the other, redfish and Captiva Pass is opened up now until most all that water out of the river goes up that way.
Yeah.
When it does, it goes around through Pine Island and it keeps it fresh.
I remember
sure.
one time I went over to Tarpon Bay and, I think maybe it was about in February. And every piece of grass that was growing in the bay was covered with little tiny scallops, little tiny live scallops. I still have a lot of those in my collection. The shelling was pretty good in those days too, wasn't it?
Betty wanted to hear about red tide.
Oh, that wasn't good.
Chamber of Commerce is not gonna like us if we tell them about the red tide.
The first red tide I can remember, of course you remember before that, was in the fall of '52. And it was really pretty bad. And there were things on the beach that you never saw before. Moray eels and things from far out, much deeper. Do you remember that one? 52?
Yeah, the county tried to bury some of them along the beaches out there and
It was
get
bad.
some of the odor down.
I think that's the worst one I can remember. That it lasted so long.
Well, not only was it smelly, but there was some gas that escaped that attacked people's, it irritated throats,
Right.
noses,
Mhm.
eyes.
Mhm.
Where you lived on the beach or not.
Yes,
You could
that's
be back in the
right.
middle of the island and still cough.
That's
right.
right.
Alan, there was a really bad one in the late 40s.
Yes, there was a bad one back in the late 40s. And that's when you couldn't hardly drive on the beach at all. Because the catfish would be dead and you'd run over 'em
Spines.
with your tires.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, that
Yeah.
spine would go right through a tire.
So it cut out a lot of beach driving back in those.
Yes. Well, the only bad one, of course, that I remember was the one at 52. But as I remember afterwards, after the fish had decayed and the odor had pretty well abated, there was so many bones on the beach that you couldn't walk on the beach barefooted.
The shelling was good too during the red tide, if you could stand it.
See, Uncle Art says that when they had the homestead on the island and to go fowl on the homestead or do different things that you'd have to do when you did have the homestead, the center or the place to go for it was Key West, and that was a county seat or a place for this part of Florida where you had your homestead. Anyhow, they used to sail back and forth to Key West quite often. And he says one trip they went down there, why they got into red tide, and they had a sailboat, and the fish are drifting with the wind, and they were with the wind, and they said it was a miserable trip.
I bet it was.
But this was back in 17, 18. So the red tides had been here for a long time.
Yes.
People didn't cause the red tide
No.
back in those days anyway, because there were no people here.
Right.
So red tide's been around for a long time.
Speaking of mosquitoes, we talked about mosquitoes a while ago. When we were getting ready to move down to Florida, and there was an old fella came to see me to tell me about when he was a boy, and he was an old man then, and that's been 40 years ago, and I guess he was probably in his 80s. And he told me that when he was just a lad, about 14 years old, that he worked for a fishing company out of Jacksonville. And they fished. They, of course, only had sail power. But he said they fished all the way around onto this side of Florida and fished in the bays, and that they had fished in San Carlos Bay between Sanibel Island and the mainland, and that when they were fishing in there, they would get becalmed. They'd get completely calm. They would have no movement of air, and they couldn't move their boats. And when they did that, the mosquitoes would descend upon them from off the mainland because the wind didn't keep them blown away. And he said the only way that they could survive was to get in water up to their neck. They'd grease their head with porpoise grease and get in the water up to their neck and just wait until a little breeze came enough to move the boat. Now that's a mosquito story. How much of it you want to believe is up to you.
What was the name of the mosquito man who lived in one of the lighthouses? Named James or Jim?
Jim and Betty.
Yeah, his
Jim
wife's
and
name was
Betty.
Betty.
Hager
Hager.
Hager. Yeah, Jim and Betty Hager.
Did he work for, what department in the government? He worked for the government, I thought.
Yes, he did. But what would it be?
Fish and Wildlife?
Was he involved with the
Mosquito control.
He
He was
was
an
before
entomologist.
mosquitoes.
He was an entomologist who was studying mosquitoes.
when they were making them radioactive and all, and tracing them and doing all that.
Wasn't that the
that was the screwworm
screwworm that they were
study.
making, and what we used to call them the goat boys, you know, the young men that had a herd of goats and they were experimenting with the screwworm. And they had their little herd of goats in a pen down toward the lighthouse, on the road to the lighthouse. Is that right? I know when they left Esperanza took some of the goats.
I remember that at Jack Cole's, his wife had a little one. The very first time we were on the island with Mary Jo and Chris, she brought a little kid out in her arms for them to hold.
I bet that was from that herd. Well, they did some radioactive work, and remember there was a little old house, I think Fitzhugh's owned it, that was on the south side of Periwinkle, and they had a big sign on there, say radioactive material. Everybody was afraid to go near it.
Yeah, they had the mosquito controllers form some experiments and see how far they would migrate. So they had the catchers, mosquito catchers scattered all up and down the coast. And so they'd raise them in radioactive water, hatch them, and let them, and turn them loose. And then they, when they caught them in these catchers scattered up and down the coast, they'd check them, see if they had any radioactive in them. And they got some as far north as Punta Gorda. And then south was below Naples down there, I think it was. Then he took a balloon and ran it up in the air with a catcher on that to see how high they would go. Then on a still night, they'd take a boat out into the Gulf or in the bay and see how far they'd fly offshore.
You know, the wind would carry them quite a ways offshore too. When you
Yeah,
got
the
a
wind would carry them.
Because I fished with Jake Stokes some, and we were fishing for tarpon out in the Gulf. And I don't know how far we were out, but we were quite a ways out, and it was very pleasant out there until the wind came up off the mainland blowing out to sea, and it brought so many mosquitoes out we had to quit. It wasn't comfortable to be that many mosquitoes. We had to quit and come in.
There's nothing for them to go out a mile.
Yeah.
Aunt Rose and Scotia Bryant had one of those mosquito traps behind their house, and they never did know how many mosquitoes were in it because it was so full that no more could get in.
And remember, they didn't count them, they weighed them.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah.
There were so many, they couldn't count them.
We had at one time, not here, it was in Sarasota, but I remember my mother going out the door with one of these lamps, like that one there, the oil lamp. And of course, light attracts mosquitoes. and she was going down the steps with it. And so there weren't many of them come into it until he got up underneath the air vent that comes into the bottom and choked the light out. Now that's mosquitoes.
Yeah.
I went,
Well, somebody told me, this is another mosquito story. Somebody told me one time that if I thought they were too bad to go out in when I got up in the morning, that I should take one of these old-fashioned 10-quart cups with a handle on the side, you know, and open the door and reach out and make one dip in the air. And if I got less than a half gallon of mosquitoes in that quart cup, it was safe to go on out.
I have been thinking about the first time I went to Bailey's store. It was the day after Labor Day in 1952, and I was shopping, and I heard a voice say, "You're new on Sanibel, aren't you?" And I turned around, it was Charlotta Matthews. Now, can you imagine going to Bailey's store now and saying, "You're new on Sanibel"?
She was such a nice woman,
Oh,
such a
I should
gracious
say,
woman.
I should say.
She welcomed newcomers.
Yes, she did. Hmm. And then one day I was driving down the road, and there was a little girl walking along, well, teenage girl walking along, and I stopped and asked her for a ride, if she wanted to ride, and she said yes, and she got in, and it was Marietta Hires. And I told her we had moved to the island. She couldn't believe it, that anybody would move to the island. But we did.
What did you do when you moved here?
Well, we had some rental cottages and sea-grape cottages, which are down toward the lighthouse. And Jim got into the building business, and then later into real estate. And,
Talk a little bit about businesses when you moved on the island and what was here and how business moved leisurely.
well, of course, Bailey's store was the only grocery store on the island. They had a Servel gas refrigerator sort of in the middle of the floor, and in that they had some lunch meat and cheese and some cold drinks. But if you wanted milk or meat, you ordered them to come out on the mailboat the next day. There were shelves along the walls, and the canned goods were on the shelves. And I remember there were big flat containers of something called Klim, which is milk spelled backwards. And that was the milk, you know, unless you ordered it. And Francis,
It was dry powdered.
it was dry powdered milk. And Francis Bailey told me one time that he grew up on Clem. He never knew what fresh milk was until he was a great big boy. And then I think there were shell shops. Mrs. Cockrell had a shell shop. And did anyone else have a shell shop?
Clara Strand up on
Oh, on
Captiva.
Captiva, Clara
And
Strand.
how about Jimmy?
Oh, yeah,
He sold a few shells down
yeah.
towards the light.
Lighthouse in
Williams, James and
James.
Snooky Williams, and then they had shells in their house.
They just had a little bench outside.
Yeah.
Mhm.
But they sold shells commercially. They sold shells to an aquarium concern who dyed them and used them in home aquaria. And then Ethel Snyder had a dress shop.
Only in the winter.
Only in the winter. She had a dress shop in Highlands, North Carolina in the summer, and in the winter she had a dress shop, which was in her home on the Gulf Beach. Now, I don't know what's there now. Do you know what's there now? Must be a condo.
Must be a
Yeah,
condo.
must be a condo. And then the Seahorse shop was built after that. That was about the first, wasn't that about the first shop that just carried a lot of gifts and clothing too? When did you build, Mary? About 54?
We opened
53?
January '54.
Mhm. Mhm.
See, when we built, when we were on the road with the plumbing shop,
Mhm.
why, Jack Cole, his restaurant down there, was the
Mhm.
first one.
Mhm.
Then I think we were the second. And beauty shop.
Oh, yes,
was the
Mary
next
Alec
one.
was here before we.
Yeah, she was
arrived.
here before we arrived.
That was the third one. Jack Cole was the first one with his restaurant, and we with the plumbing shop, and then Mary Alec with the,
With the beauty shop.
from Tarpon Bay to Fairyland.
Now, wasn't Jack's restaurant, which is now a Harbor House, wasn't it open air first, just a screen?
They did have kind of open air. It was, not even screened.
Not even
And,
screened?
You come into the front door, and then they had a bar on the right-hand side. And then behind the bar, he had a rope that he pulled up, and it pulled up a little thing that closed in that side of it. Then outside of that was a shelf. This is back when before we integrated.
Mhm.
So when you hear a knock outside there, why, he'd pull it up, and Edmund or some of the rest of them would be there, and they'd serve them beer.
Well, now, when was the Casuarina opened?
See, Casuarina?
Casuarina was a little restaurant down by the ferry landing.
Now, that was way back.
Before?
Somewhere back in there. Marietta lived there.
Yeah, Marietta worked there.
Gene and Vince and Betty were the ones that opened that.
Who did?
Gene and Vince.
Oh, no, it was open before that. Mhm.
I forget who built
Yeah.
it.
It belonged to Ernest. Ernest
Yeah.
owned the building,
Yeah, and he wanted it there for his ferry patrons.
for their convenience, so they
Uh-huh.
could have
Mhm.
a cold drink or sandwich.
And I can't remember the name of the people who were there before Vince and Jean McFetty.
I don't remember when they came. Were they there when you arrived?
Vince was doing some work on the building when we arrived, to live. Now, when we were here to visit earlier that year, there was another couple in it, and I can't remember their names. He was a very tall man. You remember? I don't remember their names.
Well, Gene and Vince managed it until the Nutmeg Girls,
Mhm,
till
mhm,
Evelyn Pearson and Betty Sears took over.
mhm.
And the Episcopalian Church met there on Sunday,
Right.
remember?
Mhm.
Right.
I remember that Susan Bailey was christened in the Episcopal Church when it was down at the Casuarina restaurant.
Did Hadwin show movies there?
Hadwin?
I guess
I
not.
don't think
Hadwin
so.
showed movies at the Casabel, I guess.
At
At the
Casabel
community-
and at the community
Community
house.
house.
And at
to the
the
south
At the
east.
barn itself.
barn on
Barn,
South
south
East.
And he showed us Island Inn too.
Yeah.
Yeah, he showed.
And he showed for the black people
Oh, yes, he
Mhm.
did. Mhm.
in the schoolhouse gallery.
Mhm.
Schoolhouse gallery.
Yeah.
That used